A multicultural and gender studies perspective is grounded in what, in our field, we call situated knowledge, a term that was primarily popularized by Dr. Donna Haraway at UC Santa Cruz, and I know she's down at Hippie U, but she's smart. A little more detail on that. Dr. Nancy Chwana says, scientists and theologians work within the worldview of their times. The theories they develop and the facts they accept must be coherent with this system of beliefs. That's only one excerpt, obviously, from a book. She goes on to say, of course there are theologians and of course there are scientists who do leap beyond the worldviews of their time, who make, I'm tempted to say a quantum leap, but I don't know enough about physics to really be able to use that, but you know, they make humongous leaps beyond the confines of their worldview. But nonetheless, most scientists and most theologians are going to be affected by the world in which they live and the ideologies that they have internalized, that they have taken in with the air they breathe and such. Dr. Sally Slocum, in an essay she wrote about prevailing arguments about man, the hunter, caveman, and all that, notes that questions in science, questions always determine and limit the answers. The basis of any discipline is not the answers it gets, but the questions it asks. So one might say, if Sigmund Freud hadn't existed in a very, very androcentric, male-centered culture, might he have asked a question different than, what does it mean to have a penis or not have a penis? And hence developing penis envy, et cetera, and all those theories. Maybe he might have asked a question like, what does it mean for a young boy to realize he'll never get to grow those really groovy breasts? Then we might have had a whole different theory, but that wasn't the approach that was taken because of the ideological perspective from which he came. So we've got, as evidences, some other evidences of worldview affecting science and religion, the whole eugenics movement. Huge, absolutely huge, not just in Nazi Germany, but in this country too. I mean, people got eugenics certificates if they were appropriately Aryan, sort of like a marriage certificate, except that it said, please go forth and procreate. These were handed out at various, what you call them, science booths, at fairs. They were handed out in churches to white middle-class people, of course. We've got books like this recently published, Why Men Don't Iron, The Science of Gender Studies. Do you think maybe that's a little bit culturally situated? Matt Redley, evolutionary psychologist, the Red Queen, arguing about how, of course, men are naturally promiscuous because that's what they had to do to spread that seed, as you know, cave dudes and such, or even earlier than that, and so on. I'm racing along, as you can tell. But here's an example of a leap from the societal belief system. Chris Notaro writing, Will Gender Exist 100 Years from Now, in the Journal Institute for Emerging Ethics and Technologies just a few months ago. It has been shown that the structure of brains in Homo sapiens can take on either a male or female form from a variety of factors during critical postnatal periods. It's not just about what kind of hormone wash you got in the womb, which is a real popular theory now. It's oversimplified in pop science, not in real science so much. The biology of sexual identity is revealing important data that points to diversity in sexual orientation, leading us to accept that looking at gender in a binary fashion, just men, just women, just hetero, just homo, that sort of thing, is unacceptable. Gender identity in Homo sapiens is probably much more ambiguous and diverse than we once thought. That's his typo, not homo. Should be than, sorry, I just teach English. A post-binary gender society is possible not only in the future, but it may already be here naturally. So when we talk about situated knowledge in my field, we're not saying that religion and science are totally stuck in their society's worldviews. Leaps happen not as often as one might wish. Third fallacy, the well, obviously, or our reductionist views of science and religion. You know, the know-it-all and the happy face, sad face. I looked and looked to try to find happy face, sad face with blinders on, and I can't use that paint thing, so I couldn't draw myself. So all religion's wonderful, all science is bad. All science is wonderful, all religion is bad. That really simplistic stuff. Easy response. No. For example, okay, white supremacy. Most of the white supremacist movements in the U.S. are grounded pretty strongly in their version of Christianity. So one could argue Christianity can really have a negative impact on racial ethnic diversity and such. Christianity helped support slavery. There are all sorts of biblical texts you can go to for that. Slaves obey your masters, that sort of thing. However, Christianity also informed civil rights movements, from Sojourner Truth, formerly enslaved, deeply devout woman leading the railroad and all, up through Martin Luther King, and all sorts of other examples. Another simplistic one. Christians hate same-sex partnerships and desire, and Christians only believe in literalism of the Bible, creationism, and besides that, they also think that the schools are biased against them and everybody hates them. And it's overly simple. Obviously, there are theologians who are very, very gay, lesbian, bi, trans, inclusive, and positivist, not just in terms of welcoming those other people into our church, but actually positive. There are people who are deeply Christian who are evolutionists. Don't oversimplify. Final quick point, and the last fallacy, the "it's on Fox, NPR, the front page, and so it must be true" fallacy, which tends to be grounded in gee whiz science and religion. I don't have my contacts in right now because I have a scratch on one of my eyes, so I can't tell if any of my students are here right now. But this is like almost a religion to me. I am so upset about gee whiz science and religion and how people just buy it. And it happens all over the place. And again, this is usually one of those places where things will come together, religion and science, in these horrific ways often, that people just lap up. Breaking Christian News, BCN website, The Informed, Inspired, and Intrigued. Astonishing story of a doctor who subjected faith to the rigors of science and then became a test subject herself. And it goes on to say how all of these studies have proven that prayer is effective. And it was published in the Western Journal of Medicine. Yeah, but it was actually critiqued mightily by scientists for pretty shoddy research. I'm not saying that prayer can't be effective or whatever, but this is that gee whiz science stuff, where the science itself was pretty questionable. Or you may have heard about these, the gay gene, the God gene, both from your friend and mine, Dean Hamer. I could go on and on about his work, but I won't. But it's pretty iffy too, which is not to say that there aren't necessarily genetic factors that affect us, but the gee whizness of the way that it's presented, like, you know, there's one light switch that you turn on. Ding, I'm a God believer. Ding, I'm gay. And people buy it. Okay, multicultural and gender studies informed critical response is when scientific and religious information and ideas are too often irresponsibly disseminated, applied, and accepted based on what best fits one's worldview and wishes, needs, and I could have said biases and meannesses. So, a call to action from my field. Okay, from me, but most people might be able to. 2 point, number 1, we need to recognize tensive complexity within science and religion and between science and religion. And second, we have to accept responsibility for critical dissemination and consumption of religion and science, or science and religion.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Greg Pitsona, who is the Associate Pastor for Adult Discipleship and College Ministries at Bidwell Presbyterian Church next door. He's also an adjunct faculty member in the philosophy department at Butte College and has his BA from Berkeley, an MDiv from Princeton Theological Seminary, and his PhD in systematic and philosophical theology from the Graduate Theological Union at Berkeley. He's taught on the subject of science and religion at Brooklyn College and chairs the Chico Triad on philosophy, theology, and science in Chico, and helped organize the conferences related to that organization over the last few years. He recently wrote a book on the subject entitled Creation and Last Things, at the intersection of theology and science. Greg Pizzona.
Thanks, Joel. And this is exciting to hear all the presentations. My talk will be on the relationship between science and religion. I hope to set out a little bit of a typology that can be helpful in understanding how these two huge fields and huge sets of different entities exist together. I go back 45 years to a book written by a physicist, Ian Barber, at Carleton College. That's really set the tone for the current studies in science and religion. It's called Issues in Science and Religion. I have a fuzzy picture of it, but I guess that's appropriate when things are 45 years old. Ian Barber really defined 4 great ways to understand these two huge disciplines, and or sets of disciplines, you might say. And I think these 4 ways are really helpful as we set the questions, as we interact on these topics. The first is conflict, that these two see each other as enemies, an attack. It's the wrestling match approach to them, very popular in the press, of course. Independence, separate ways of understanding. I'll explain that in a second. And then, let me give you a diagram to say that conflict, 2 arrows going at one another. You might think of that. Independence, 2 arrows in parallel lines, never meeting, of course, mathematically. The third and fourth both come out of the sense that these can come together. Dialogue, where there is a polite interchange of insights. Remembering Barber is an academic, and he saw conferences where people would talk about such things but never really have a give and take. So he promoted integration, where a real give and take place and where transformation occurs. So let me just outline those 3 of those a little bit. Of course, attacks by scientists on the Christian faith and the science side. Richard Dawkins, what a beautiful example of that. He asserts that God by science can be disproved. He says, yes, God is improbable, therefore atheism is correct, and belief in God is a delusion. One thing you can always say about Dawkins, he's extremely clear. Evolution to him is the only game in town. It describes everything that is, and that includes for him all other theories and disciplines, including literature, philosophy, and so on, and leaves no room for God. So this is a clear conflict model. On the other side, you might put in Philip Johnson, who was with key spokesperson for the intelligent design movement. I could have moved to Ken Ham, but that would be an unfair comparison, I think. But Philip Johnson, formerly at the University of California, Berkeley's Law School, says this in his goal in the famous document called the Wedge document. Isn't that right? The Wedge document? In the Wedge. We'll call it the Wedge. To convince people that Darwinism is inherently atheistic, that science by its nature is materialistic in both philosophy and methodology, and therefore is against religion. So clear conflict model examples. Now, I want to say that popularly there is some confusion, that this model often gets knee-jerk assent. I hear it within people of faith, people out of faith, people beyond faith who say that's the way it always is and always will be. But just to be clear, that has not really been the dominant version in Western history, and we can go on about this in question and answer. It's a really interesting historical study. But let me just give one piece of evidence, or at least reflection. This comes from the Nobel laureate Charles Towne, who was at UC Berkeley, commenting on the relationship of science and religion. He says this: for the successful type of science we know, we must have faith that the universe is governed by reliable laws, and further that these laws can be discovered by human inquiry. And he goes on to say that this kind of reliability in the structure of the universe is based on a commitment that it is grounded in a monotheistic understanding of creation. So historically, in monotheistic West, that's been the seedbed for the growth of science. It's historically true, it's also philosophically true, and we can talk about that. Now then, the second model is the independence model. Again, we could look at a lot of people who discuss this. The great Stephen Jay Gould, who just died a few years back, has in his books NOMA, Non-Overlapping Magisteria. I love the way he writes this. It's real. I don't know. I just think it's fascinating, his style. Science and religion do not glower at each other. but interdigitate in patterns of complex fingering and at every fractal scale of self-similarity. I'm not exactly sure what it means, but it sounds really cool. He says that, though, these are two different disciplines that do not really overlap, and they are places for free inquiry. Similarly, Albert Einstein, love that picture. Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. Now we would go, so I'm sorry, and this is not the same, this is going to the next slide, I'm sorry, into integration. So I'm moving beyond dialogue into integration. You got Noma with Gould, now Einstein pushing us into what integration might be. And I want to be clear, Einstein was not a monotheist in the sense we would take him to be. He's a follower of Spinoza, so let's just be clear about that. Nonetheless, he saw a place for religion. More clearly, a religious, in this case a churchgoer, Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, one of the most prominent scientists in our country, has said this: I find that studying the natural world is an opportunity to observe the majesty, the elegance, and the intricacy of God's creation. Someone who's spent a lot of time on the Human Genome Initiative and on some of the genetic and biological sciences, so very interesting voice in relation to what we've heard earlier. And then Pope John Paul II, in case you're not following the succession of popes, this is the second to the one before the current Pope Benedict, said this: science can purify religion from error and superstition. Religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. Each can draw the other into a wider world, a world in which both can flourish. Now, if you know how you set up typologies, you make the good one, the one that you support, and the last one. So, of course, I'm promoting integration and loading it up with some great scholars to give me support. I nonetheless want to let you know this goes back to my own tradition, which is in Calvinism or Presbyterianism. John Calvin said this in his 1559 Institutes of the Christian Religion: if we regard the Spirit of God as the sole fountain of truth, we shall neither reject the truth itself nor despise it wherever it shall appear, unless we wish to dishonor the Spirit of God. So if truth is found in science, it is honorable to God to follow that truth. I think there's an interesting fifth way. I don't know if you can read this, but I like this fifth way because maybe it integrates a little bit of Chico mentality. Science versus religion. You can argue all you want about photons and miracles. I'll be out here with a cold beer and a barbecue grill, not really waiting for an answer. It might be a good antidote to some of us who are really, exercise over this relationship. Anyway, I want to move on just to 2 points. The first is I would love it to not be so, because I'm a little bit tired of this topic, but evolution and creationism will always be with us. I'll do it through bumper stickers, sort of. Here is the one you've probably seen, famous Christian symbol in Greek, spells Greek words that mean Jesus Christ, God's Son, Savior. And then, of course, there's the Darwin antidote with gaining little feet at the fish. And then, of course, a little bit of Christian triumphalism where the fish eats Darwin. All right, I want to promote that it's great to talk about evolution and creation. Please ask me those questions if you would like. If you're interested, ask me. But I really believe that the future of science and religion is that the cognitive sciences, the cognitive neurosciences, the Chico Triad has been taking this on for the last several months and probably will continue to do so because there's a lot to be done here. A few questions you might ask in light of the discoveries of cognitive science. Are religious experiences simply physical phenomena? And here, Dr. Herringer's presentation gave you some directions in this way. How do the recent discoveries in neuroscience tell us how we are wired? This is the most important question in my understanding. How does the brain relate to the mind, and what are the implications for the soul? And I can go into some quotes on that, but do religious people believe in a disembodied soul? Third, is there a God spot in the brain? Is there a place that we are God-wired, you might say? Fourth, this is a very fascinating question about ethics. Do we make ethical decisions rationally, emotionally, or both? Just attended the American Academy of Religion in Atlanta and went to a section of papers on this. And it's fascinating to look at the way the brain works in terms of ethical decisions. And then this is my prosaic, or maybe Prozacic question. If we can find chemicals like Prozac that affect depression and despair, what does that mean for the way God made us? In a little bit more religious language, do these become media of salvation for us? When we don't need to pray or study the Bible, can we just take Prozac and get over these things? So I want to conclude with quoting one of my own mentors in this study, a key voice in understanding the relationship of science and religion, Alfred North Whitehead, mathematician, philosopher, and at the end of the day was asked by the president of Harvard to teach philosophy, having moved over from Cambridge to do that, and worked out a philosophy that engaged both religion and science. And he said this, I believe it was 1925, in Science in the Modern World. When we consider what religion is for mankind, I hope we can excuse the gender specificity given the time. When we consider what religion is for mankind and what science is, it is no exaggeration to say that the future course of history depends upon the decision of this generation as to the relations between them. They didn't decide it in 1925, they haven't decided it necessarily for the last few generations, so maybe it's our time to see how to get this relationship right, and I'm glad we are talking about it tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Our last two speakers before we take our break, and I'd like to introduce John Mahoney. John is Associate Professor of Biology here at Chico State. His BA and PhD are from the University of Minnesota, and he did a postdoctoral fellowship at Rockefeller University in New York. His areas of emphasis are in immunology, infectious diseases, and biological evolution. He has co-taught a class on science and human values at the philosophy department for the past 10 years, has presented before the Chico skeptics at their local meetings, and recently went on live local radio to debate with a minister on the question of intelligent design and biological evolution, and he also is a great guitar player. John Mahoney.
As a matter of fact, I have some guitar envy seeing some of those pictures of scientists with their I think ES-335 Gibsons. That was pretty cool. I'm going to, well, first of all, it's not good in this sort of a format to come toward the end because you have everything before you, and maybe some of the things that you're going to say have already been sort of dealt with. So I hope I don't say anything in terms of gee whiz science or gee whiz religion, and I'm afraid I am going to probably adhere to the conflict model in terms of how science and religion do interrelate. And regarding the bumper stickers, I do have the fish bumper sticker on my car, and it says sushi. So at any rate, what I'd like to do is talk about what I think the relationship is between science and religion. And I'm going to talk both from my perspective as a biologist, and I'm also going to talk from my personal perspective in terms of how I've come to view the natural world as I do. So I would say first off that I am a skeptic. And by that I mean that I need evidence to believe things. And so I really do base my worldview primarily on whether or not there's evidence to support a particular truth claim or not. So that being the case, if we talk about how science and religion relate, and from my perspective, one of the big issues here, as we've seen, is this idea of evolution. And the fact that a lot of people, especially Americans, seem to be very afraid of the truth or the fact of evolution. And that may be understandable because, as it turns out, most Americans don't understand evolution. They can't give you a working definition of even what evolution is. So it's not surprising that people might have confusion about something that they don't understand in the first place. So let me see if I can trace back the history a little bit. And I'm going to make a comparison, and I hope I don't say things that are overly naive here, but here goes. So I think that one of the commonalities between science and religion is that they are attempts to explain the world. They answer the big questions. You know, where did we come from? What are we anyway? And you know, what's the purpose in life? And so these sorts of big questions have been really hard to come up with satisfying answers. And yet, as was mentioned by my colleagues, as animals, as a primate species, we are pattern seeking, we are purpose-seeking, and we are very groupish. The fact that we have evolved to be the sorts of organisms that we are really is based on those common features. And if we look at our close cousins, we can see some of those types of similarities that we share with non-human primates, like the chimps and the bonobos, for example. So I think that really where a conflict, if a conflict arose, and maybe the first conflict to look at would be Galileo, in terms of suggesting that things might have a little different spin than was ordinarily accepted. But I'm going to focus primarily on what Darwin brings to the table. And the fact is that what Darwin did by proposing evolution, his theory of evolution, and he actually did not come up with the idea of evolution. It had been proposed by many other philosophers, thinkers, naturalists. But what Darwin did in quite a remarkable way is he actually explained the mechanism behind evolution, what drives evolution as a process. And Darwin, as you probably know, was a very interesting fellow from the standpoint that he had this idea that he really had worked out when he was just right out of Cambridge and went on a 5-year trip around the world and started thinking about it. And fortunately, he had a rich physician father, so he was independently set, and he could do science and really think about this quite a bit. It took him many years, though, and as a matter of fact, it took someone else coming up with the idea to force him to publish. And one of the things that he wrote in a letter to a friend about evolution is he said, "It feels like confessing a murder." And by that, he really felt that unleashing this theory of evolution was going to be in such contradistinction to the accepted worldview of natural theology. That is, God designs the natural world, and we really worship and glorify God by being naturalists and showing that the world is designed in this remarkable way that only an omniscient, intelligent designer could have created. Well, Darwin's mechanism suggests no, there is no design in nature, not that kind of design. There is no purpose in the sense of teleology, that we are not evolving toward any sort of goal. We evolve, as Darwin would say, because there are certain selective pressures in whatever the local environment that we happen to be in. And as humans spread out throughout the world, we have evolved in different ways because of different local selective pressures. So that explains some of the human diversity, and some of the other explanations are not so good. So this idea of design, I think, is one that's very attractive. And in Darwin's day, it was called natural theology, and it was promoted by thinkers like William Paley, who Darwin actually studied with while he was at Cambridge. And the idea goes something like this, that if you're walking along on a heath, and you happen to see a watch, and you pick up that watch, you know that that watch had to have a designer. So there's some intricacy of mechanism there. And you wouldn't expect that that would arise by chance, that stones collided together and voila, you have a watch. Paley would also argue that if you look at the human eye, or any eye for that matter, that again, that's ample evidence of design based on the fact that it's a complicated mechanism. It seems to work so well. And so natural theology is sort of the starting point in terms of how we had viewed the world. And the Darwinian view of natural selection, with the fact that we have mutation, that we have variation, and then there's this non-purposeful, non-teleological process of selecting the winners and the losers, really goes smack counter to the existing view that things happen for a reason, and that reason is some kind of a design. So I think that there's an enormous conflict that gets set up, certainly between an evolutionary explanation for life and the natural theological explanation for life. Now, interestingly, at that time, natural theology was also bolstered from the standpoint that it's not just looking at living organisms. You can actually look at the inorganic world. You can look at the way the earth goes around the sun, the seasons, the length of the day, the temperature changes, and all of that works in perfect concert with the fact that trees know when to bloom, know when to bear fruit, and it all seems so intricate that it has to be designed. So this idea that it could not be designed really confronts your personal credulity, right? You just can't believe that it could be otherwise. And yet, as we look more and more at evolutionary explanations, and what Darwin knew in his time and what we know today are worlds apart in terms of the types of evidence that we have to support this kind of a view. So I think it's really safe to say that, from the biological standpoint, that Darwin's theory of evolution really did forever break the great chain of being. And it shows that as animals, that we are not somehow unique, we are not somehow separate, we are not somehow special as living organisms. We have evolved to no more or less an extent than any other organism that is alive today. And again, that view that biology offers through evolution is threatening to a lot of people. Now, you've also heard mention of different ways of reconciling science and religion, and there is Stephen Jay Gould, who's a brilliant evolutionary biologist, who proposed this non-overlapping magisteria model. Gould, I think, was a self-professed agnostic. It's kind of hard to tell reading various works. But at any rate, here's what I'm going to propose, that I think that this artificial separation of science and religion is problematic. And I think it's problematic because I think that there is an overlap that's both inevitable and just hard to explain away. So I'll propose this sort of a distinction. I would say that science is a method, it's an investigation that uses logical consistency, it uses intellectual honesty, respect for evidence, and parsimony to try to come up with explanations of the natural world. And in saying that, I would say that science does have the expertise, or does have the methodology that has proven to be very successful. We know a lot more about the natural world, and we can do a lot more things today based on what we have learned through science. I think religion, on the other hand, while makes claims into the natural world, works through an entirely different type of methodology. And from that standpoint, I think that they're not only separate magisteria, but I think that they're also incompatible magisteria, because I don't think that they are the same way of knowing about the world. So I'm not sure that this conflict or tension or separation is really the key point to think about. I think that one of the ways to look at science and religion and what they propose to do is to look at how they achieve those particular ends. And I would argue that they don't have really anything in common between natural explanations and what I would say would be supernatural explanations from a religious perspective. And indeed, here's where I think some of the conflict comes and some of the problem comes. And that's when religion will make claims about aspects of the natural world that are problematic and go counter to scientific knowledge or explanations. So, for example, when religious claims about when life begins, or about what sort of sexuality is considered sinful or not, whether global warming is going to take place. I think that those are claims that religion can make about the natural world that I think are inappropriate claims, and I think that those are claims that as skeptics, as scientists, that we have to reject, because there's no evidence essentially to support those kinds of claims. Now, I think that there's a notion here that as scientists that we think about the world in a scientific way and tend to be less religious. And indeed, I think Chris showed that in biologists it was, what, 32%. I think that number is actually a higher number in terms of non-religious, because physicians are lumped in with the biological scientists there, and as a group they tend to be more religious than biologists do. I can tell you from my own perspective, though, that it's not a conflict between science and religion that sort of leads me to my secular humanism, but rather, to sort of illustrate the point, I was raised in an Irish Catholic family, and I attended Catholic parochial school for 10 years. I was an altar boy, so I have a pretty in-depth understanding and knowledge of religious world and religious culture. But I did come to be a secular humanist at a pretty early age, and at an age before I had any really sophistication with respect to knowing about science or even evolutionary biology. So I would submit that I think that the conflict here is not between science and religion. I think that the underlying tension here is between accepting things based on evidence and reason and accepting things based on faith. Thank you.
Our last speaker is Lou Buchholz, professor of physics at Chico State. He's been here for 25 years. He has his BA from Oberlin College and a PhD in theoretical physics from Stanford. He did postdoctoral study in Germany and at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, and his scientific interests have been focused on supercondensed Fermi systems and statistical mechanics. Throughout his career, he has sought to maintain a persistent, informal, and eclectic program of including a humanistic component in all of his science teaching. Dr. Buchholz.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin my remarks this evening with just a short litany of a few of the astounding and troubling revelations about our physical world that modern science has confronted us with, and then present my personal responses to them. By the way, I have something for Joel Dimmelman here. This is something I've resisted doing for most of my lifetime, and certainly I was asked to do this many times by your successor, Don Hines, and I always put him off. So I think I'll do it, right? By the way, I have only 2 slides. I thought that I might just shovel through this, but I decided not to. I'll just put an outline on a board there, and I'll do the reading, most of the reading, just from my notes here. First is, I think I'd like to point out, is that the physical world is far, far stranger than most people ever suspected. This is true on any scale that you look. If you look on the mega scale, the scale of the cosmos, you find a world that is utterly unlike anything you know. We've discovered that it's vastly larger than most people know or can ever imagine. And by the way, it's almost empty. Our corner of the universe is not anything like what is typical. And if there are things in it, weird things, you've maybe heard of them. It has quasars, it has black holes, it has event horizons. That's weird stuff that we do know. It also is filled with weird stuff that we don't know. Stuff like dark energy and dark matter, which we now believe makes up most of the universe. It's also filled with really weird stuff. Stuff like the many universes concept, which may or may not be true, and wormholes connecting all these different universes. All of these things are facts. By the way, the fact that the universe probably contains extraterrestrial life is now a near certainty, and rather banal. But you didn't have to go way out into the universe to discover all these things. You could actually come here at home and get some garden variety marvels right here at home. Most people are not aware that space and time are nothing like what they suspect. The fact that non-causal events can be experienced in any order. Are you aware of that? Yeah. The concept of absolute simultaneity is out the window. You can, in one human lifetime, reach the edge of the cosmos hundreds of billions of light years away. Did you know that? Yeah, anyone can go there. And in one human lifetime. And by the way, although you can't enter your own future, you can enter your neighbor's future. Did you know that? This is quite generic. Or if you want really strange things, you needn't go out, you go in. The micro world, simply beyond imagination. You go to the micro world and what do you discover? There is no arrow of time. There's no forward and backward in time. Did you know that? Did you know that in the micro world, entities don't have to be anywhere? You don't have to be located. Did you know that? There's also no personal identity. Identity is gone in the micro world. Even non-being doesn't exist. Yeah, particles come in and out of existence transitively all the time. Just pop, 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 pop. So, essential randomness actually rules the day. I go down to our second point here. And by the way, I'd love to dwell on this. I haven't the time. But I'd like to mention it. And that is, it may be a shock to most people that our ability to extract information, even from our most beloved and trusted theories, is far, far more minimal than what most people suspect. Yes, progress may appear impressive, but not when compared to the size of the problem and the length of time we've been at it. Actually, once again, if you go out into the mega world, general relativity is a paradigm for intractability. If you go to our local world, kind of the meso world, the weather is a paradigm for the weather. Yeah? The Navier-Stokes and Boltzmann equations are absolutely obstinate. The quantum many-body problem, my life study, shows no progress after 50 years. If you go into the micro world, if you go down try to study atoms, the Schrodinger equation has absolutely pitifully few solutions after 75 years, and not to mention nuclear physics, QCD, or string theory. It's very, very disappointing. What is absolutely certain is that space and time and matter and motion and causality and being and non-being are, in the context of modern science, utterly unlike anything envisioned by previous generations. But it gets stranger. For even if we were able to unify all the forces of nature, would it mean that we understood nature? And the answer is absolutely not. It has been understood for at least 60 years now that the reductionist approach probably has limits, and that various phenomena are what we now call irreducibly complex. Superconductivity and superfluidity, which are my lifelong studies, are examples of these, and that doesn't mean we can't describe them somewhat, but that these descriptions have to come from above, and they can't come from below. By the way, someday we could talk about why that is. In any case, it means that these systems are more than the sum of their parts. Now, that's actually a mathematical statement, and once again, I could go into it, but I can't have the time to do it here. Anyways, they go by the name of emergent phenomena. There seems to be laws of self-organization that haven't even been imagined yet. Some very great and very serious physicists conjecture that most of the laws of physics are not yet known or even suspected. So where does all this leave me personally at this time in my life? And I'd like to give you just a few points. I start from the fact that we are most definitely of the earth. And most people are not aware that the word human, by the way, the H-U-M of human, is the same as the H-U-M in the word humus. You know, that layer of decomposing matter on the top of the soil? We are soil-bound earthlings. Now, the word human means earthling. We are compost. Yeah? In every organic way, our bodies, our responses and emotions, an entire life cycle. Number two, our brains have somehow developed self-consciousness. We can now both imagine and reason beyond the purely physical limitations of our physical bodies, and perceive what never yet was and perhaps never will be. I remind you that we have absolutely no idea how conscious perception comes about and what limitations might be set on our brains by their organic structure and inheritance. Might consciousness be an emergent phenomenon? If you find out, I'll publish. We live in perpetual, then, I say, perpetual unremitting tension between our organic trajectory and the imaginative and rational powers of our minds. The mind can wander off and imagine that it is in charge, when in fact I believe it is not. dust thou art, and to dust thou shalt return. By the way, that's, of course, the matter of the day. Today is Ash Wednesday. This shock requires a constant, serious effort of harmonization, where we face mental illness, we succumb to every vice known under the sun, and even contemplate self-destruction. Finally, I add 3 pivotal lifetime experiences. First, 40-plus years of describing nature with mathematics, which is theoretical physics. Number 2, the experience of raising children, participating in the continuance of the cycle of life. And finally, third, the experience of growing old, participating in the completion of the cycle of life. My overwhelming and convergent sense of all of these is they are, at each moment, just skating over the surface of a mysterium tremendum, an enormous mystery. The depth of this mystery is simply unfathomable, beyond telling, and beyond the soiling by any word or description, rational or representational. Anything we could possibly say is the mere shadow of the profundity inherent therein. I didn't need to invent that image, by the way. Plato, a classical Greek, used it in the parable of the shadows on the wall of the cave. The ideal forms that cast those shadows will never be known to us. In Buddhism, all over Hinduism, we find the concept of the veil of illusion. St. Paul in 1 Corinthians writes, "For now we see through a glass darkly." Shakespeare wrote in As You Like It, "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players." That is, it's a representation, a likeness, a metaphor for that which can never be known in its fullness. All religion, then, is an effort at linking back. That's what the word means, re-lego, back-linking. We link back to this realization, life to the source of life, and consciousness to the source of consciousness. In conclusion, I propose that everything we perceive is metaphorical. That is representational. The shadows will never be seen in clarity, not on this side of the river. In this sense, all religions are true, but none is unique or uniquely efficacious. I embrace metaphor because it's the fact of the matter, and because it's all we have, and because we desperately need the harmony and reconciliation with nature that symbols provide. We have then, as our tools for creating metaphors, reason and art. Of these, art is more fundamental to our existence than reason. One of our primary constructs is civilization, the art of living in groups with its culture and its rituals, which use all of the above and again express and indeed impersonate our deepest metaphors. I believe that deep culture and art is rare and should be profoundly treasured. Great artists are few and become, as it were, our shamans. In this respect, I would be called a cultural conservative, and I embrace traditional religious wisdom, ritual, and art wherever it is found. I would categorize myself as a mystic. So even as all of life is metaphorical, so also is all of life then, by my understanding, religious. I really see no point or way to make a distinction. There is certainly no conflict. There are only badly understood metaphors. I leave the final word and image to a great early romantic philosopher, poet, and polymath, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who concluded in his very last words in the very greatest and last work, Faust. And here I need some help. Did I get it? Yes. Alles Vergängliche ist nur ein Gedächtnis. Which means all perishable things are but a metaphor. And I leave you then with the last metaphor, perhaps. This is a great metaphor. I took that picture myself. It's outside a student pub in Leipzig. That's what they did in Germany. And this is, of course, Mephistopheles and Faust in discourse. Mephistopheles, of course, is the agent of the devil, and he is discoursing. He's really seducing Faust. And the metaphor, of course, could be Jesus in the wilderness. It could be the temptation of Buddha. It could also be the trial of Socrates. For we are indeed the Faustian civilization.
I see a hand in the second row, the gentleman here.
Okay, try 30 seconds. Well, the question is for Sarah. So this is just for clarification. For me, it's easier to entertain the idea that science and religion are compatible if you talk about religion general. Or something like a belief in a deity or something like that. But if you look at particular religions, actually it's easier to see the conflict. So my question is, I'm not sure I understand what you're trying to suggest there. I mean, why, looking at particular religion actually help us understand the relation between science and religion and probably see them as not being incompatible.
Well, I'm not necessarily saying that we would understand anything better. I think what I'm critiquing is just the use of Protestant Christianity as the norm. And all of these debates are really assume monotheism equals religion. And so I guess I'm really just asking some questions. How would these debates be different if we looked at religions in particular places and times, and if we took into account religions like Buddhism, or if we took into account religions like animism? I can't really think of, as someone who's trained in religious studies, I don't really think of religion generally very often. I'm interested in case studies. To me, I have more of an anthropological approach for that reason, I suppose. So, I don't know if that quite answers your question, but I more want to open it up because I think that the debate is very narrow in that way and not applicable to other places in the world. And I guess the other point I want to make, and I was trying to make with some of my examples, is that human beings often hold and practice incompatible, what we might think looking from the outside in are incompatible belief systems. But in fact, many of us hold multiple belief systems and engage in multiple practices. And that just seems something that happens everywhere and all the time. It seems to be a particular problem now with the way that these debates have been framed. So I just wanted to shift the frame a little bit.
Yes, the gentleman with the glasses, third in here.
Real quick, I just want to ask the panelists if you can pass your microphone around when you're talking, it's just so the cameraman can better pick you up when you're speaking. Cool, so I'll let Dr. Zimbelman figure out what to do with this question. But, Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow's newest book, The Grand Design, they make some pretty bold claims, not exactly positive claims, but at least claims about what could be known. And they're based on something that's entirely non-experimental at this point and actually doesn't exist, something called M theory. We don't know what it is. So I guess my question is, science at the cutting edge, leading end of it, as far as it relates to metaphysical questions such as the existence of God and things like that, doesn't have much going for it yet. Yet it's kind of placing this wager that in the future we will know what M theory is. In the future we will have experimental evidence for string theory, which is still doubtful. And so I just was wondering if particularly the scientists on the panel would comment on that.
Shall we begin with the person who works with the smallest stuff, the physicist?
I'm not sure I understood actually
The question. Are you asking questions about a physical theory?
So what I'm asking is some of the physical theories that have allowed scientists to make some of the boldest claims about, for example, the existence of God, are non-experimental, and in fact, M theory doesn't exist yet. And so I just wonder if you would comment on, is it reasonable to place that wager that we will one day know about it, or is it actually an act of faith to say, based on what we will know in the future, we will be able to say that God either doesn't exist or is unnecessary to explain the existence of the universe?
First of all, I don't know the theory you're referring to. The second thing is our vocabularies are just doing this. So you're asking questions that are, I wouldn't dream of asking the way you're doing it. And you're using words in a way that I wouldn't dream of using them. So I can't really answer you.
I think if you and I had a strong cup of coffee, we could actually do a lot. But not in a short space. You're using words in ways that are, I don't think you really have much feeling, nor should you, for what doing mathematical physics is like. So you're asking questions. We're just doing this.
Yes.
So one thing about, there are two ways that science gets done. One is there's an experiment done, and then a theory, a mathematical theory, gets made to explain it. So the experimentalists come first. In some cases, the theoreticians run with it and create new theories like superstring theory and M theory, and go back and wait for experimental evidence, which in some cases never comes. I don't see where M theory anything links to religion or God. I don't know who makes that sort of claim that these superstring theories or the multiple universe theories have anything to do with religious claims. But just something I was going to put in my talk and left out was that sometimes, I wouldn't count superstring theory as a viable theory in physics because it has zero experimental evidence yet. So it's sometimes a theory comes along and then we build a large hadron collider to look for the Higgs boson, these so-called God particles, right? And it's worth spending all this money, but maybe the theory doesn't get confirmed. Maybe the mathematics is incorrect. Where that leads to religion, I don't understand.
Can I say one thing? Just from this side rather than from my side. In this respect, English falls pathetically short. You have to realize that if you were at the time of St. Paul, and you spoke to a Hebrew and you used the word Adonai, but then you talked to a Greek and he used the word theos, right? And both of those get translated the same into English, but they mean utterly different things. So we have a tremendous vocabulary problem here. We don't need one word. So when you use one word, of course, my response is, I haven't a clue what you're talking about. I don't. And I don't know what you're talking about, and I actually don't think you really have much feel for what mathematical theories are like. So let me tell you the word that was sacred that you used wrong. When you're out on the sidewalk, most people out on the sidewalk, they use the word theory in a very casual way. Ooh, ouch. When you're inside of theoretical physics, the word theory is almost sacred. And you don't just have a theory. You know why? Because if you did, science would just crumble. So in theoretical physics, if you stand up and say, I have a theory, that's a very, very serious thing to say. Because you have to put forth your mathematics, and after you put forth your mathematics, guess what you can't say? You can't say, I didn't mean it, because you did. And we're going to take your mathematics, and we're going to deal with it. If we find out that you've proven us, we're going to rip your guts out in public. And that's what keeps science clean. You don't get to just step up and say something. No. And it's brutal. Most people don't understand that our world actually should be the entire academic world. I mean, science, academic world, it's a contact sport. Yeah, it is, and it should be. It should be, just to keep it clean. So basically, I love what you're saying, but I have a clue what you're saying.
Let's